The final element of victory in an athletic event in ancient Greece was the proclamation by the herald. After an athletic event concludes, the crowd still murmurs, the athletes catch their breath. A herald steps forward, introduced by a trumpet, and calls aloud the name of the victor, his father's name, his home city, age category, if a youth or boy, and the event in which he was victorious, along with an appropriate form of the verb nikao, I win. This is the angelia, or proclamation. The victory proclamation was a powerful and efficacious speech act. Until the herald announced the victor, athletes and spectators stood in suspense, unsure of who had won, especially in closely contested foot races, javelin tosses, or chariot races. The proclamation actualized the victory, which became a great deed only through its verbalization. The herald was thus almost a bard, and his powerful voice initiated, if only in embryonic form, the spread of an athlete's fame and glory. Such a connection was alive in antiquity. According to Plutarch, when Themistocles was asked whether he wanted to be Achilles or Homer, he responded, "Well, would you rather be the victor at the Olympic Games or the herald?" The herald's voice, however, was ephemeral, and athletes were faced with a conundrum: how to ensure that memory of their victory would reach beyond the audience of the proclamation, both into the immediate future and in perpetuity. To do so, athletes turned to poets and sculptors who used the information of the angelia to generate lasting victory monuments, whether inscribed epigrams, choral odes, or bronze statues. Representations of the angelia are therefore often included in Epinician and Epigrammatic epigram. Herodotus provides the earliest attested historical angelia. He reports that Cimon, when he won his second Olympic victory of 532 BCE, cognizant of the political value of winning, quote, "At the next Olympic Games, having won with the same horses, he gave over to Pisistratus to be proclaimed victor in the 4-horse chariot race, so that he might be allowed to return to Athens from exile with his property intact." This anecdote not only proves the multifarious utility of victory for archaic elites, but signals the contingency of the proclamation. It demonstrates that the angelia, even outside of its elusively poetic form, and that's the form I'll deal with today, need not reflect any reality. In this instance, Pisistratus did not win the chariot race, yet the herald's proclamation immediately after victory announced that he did. This and other stories like it demonstrate that the form, rather than the content, was certain. Victors or patrons or heralds or the festival authorities exercised some degree of latitude over how the various elements of the angelia were filled out. Athletes and their patrons therefore controlled to a very large degree just how they were remembered. The herald's voice and proclamation, a figure and speech act imbued with ritual potency, literary pedigree, and veracity, provided a way to enhance the memory of an athlete and his great deed, to ensure, as much as the bard records and perpetuates the deeds of epic warriors, the memory of the deeds of great athletes. In Epinician song, the metaphor of the herald and the message is prominent. The song as message and singer as herald metaphors are used throughout Pindar and Bacchylides. These metaphors help to explain praise, justify focus on the victor, and provide a veneer of authenticity and objectivity, since they seem to provide unobstructed access to the speech act of the herald at the games. Just as Pindar and Bacchylides take on other roles, such as that of guest friend, for example, to structure their song and praise, the figure of the herald and the metaphor of the message are also ways for the singer to explain, rationalize, and enhance his praise of the victor. In epigrams, metaphors of the herald and message are used less frequently, but performance and persona come to the fore. Epigrammatic acts of praise demand that we consider whose voice is being represented and with what authority this imagined voice is imbued. Epigrams inscribed on statue bases are elusive to modern readers and viewers, but only because so few inscribed bases and statues remain together. For ancients, the act of reading, or hearing read, perhaps more frequently, an epigram while gazing at a statue must have been common, especially in sanctuaries like Olympia. Since epigrams are voiced by visitors to sanctuaries or by groups engaged in the collective act of reading, individuals may take on personas, not only through words that bring us into the milieu of the herald and proclamation, but through first or second person verbs or pronouns. Today, I examine implicit and explicit heralds and messages across Epinician song and inscribed epigram. I restrict myself to actual inscribed epigrams from the 6th through 4th centuries BC, alongside the corpus of Epinician song, that is in this case the works of Pindar and Bacchylides. I focused on the figure of the herald and the message, and their ability to authenticate what are in fact secondary and elaborated speech acts. That is, we are hearing the poet's representation of the proclamation, not the proclamation itself. We and most ancient audiences had no access to the latter. By attaching themselves to the voice of the herald at the games, Epinician songs and epigrams demand that audiences take their praise seriously, as if it were the voice of the herald itself in the sacred landscape of a Pan-Hellenic sanctuary. The word angelia is not uncommon in Pindar and Bacchylides. It appears 10 times in the Epinician odes of Pindar, twice in Bacchylides' Epinician odes, and once in Bacchylides' dithyrambs. Of these instances, 7 or 8 likely refer directly or indirectly to the Epinician song itself, its contents, or are personifications of the message. Angelia and words derived from the same root are not the only ways in which Epinician song refers to the proclamation. Alongside the strict use of angelia as a message or proclamation, sometimes the song itself is imagined as the announcement of the herald, though without any word derived from an angelo root, an instance of the song as message metaphor. For example, at the end of Bacchylides' Ode 13, the singer claims that, quote, songs of delight will proclaim him to all people. I've underlined the proclaiming word, karuxanti. Bacchylides borrows the angelia here to finish his song, which is imagined as something, like the herald's proclamation, that can transmit knowledge of victory to many people. Despite the productivity of the song as message for Bacchylides, despite the productivity of the metaphor of song as message for Pindar and Bacchylides, the use of the angelia is just that, a metaphor. The Epinician song is not an objective rendering of the herald's proclamation, but a representation engaged in discourse. By identifying his elaborate song as the angelia, the Epinician song singer identifies his song with the proclamation of victory at Olympia or another sanctuary, and instills a trustworthiness to a particular manifestation of the victor's identity. Despite its apparent simplicity, or perhaps because of its apparent simplicity, the metaphor of song as message is a powerful rhetorical and literary tool of encomium. Bacchylides' short Ode 2 is another deceptively simple use of the angelia motif. The song stretches the proclamation to 14 lines. It seems to be a verse version of the actual proclamation with little elaboration, and indeed that's how it's often been understood by scholars. I'll read it. Speed to holy chaos, you giver of majesty, and carry the famous message of Charis that Argeos won the victory in the bold-handed fight, and reminded us of all the fine achievements we had displayed at the famous neck of the Isthmia, when we left the sacred land of Euxantios and won 70 garlands. And the locally born muse summons the sweet skirl of pipes as she honors with victory songs the dear son of Panthides. In this poem, the personified Fama rushes from the site of victory bearing the proclamation. The herald's voice has been abstracted from the body of one person and channeled into a self-propelling message that will travel of its own volition to holy chaos. Even in a short and apparently simple ode, Bacchylides elaborates on the supposedly objective data of the angelia and recasts the herald's proclamation as recalling the glory not only of Argeos the victor, but of his homeland of Chaos more generally. The singer explains the focus on the cumulative victories of Chaos by reference to the mus authegenes, the locally born muse, who calls forth the musical celebration. By the end of the ode, the angelia is itself now local to Chaos. The Pan-Hellenic speech act of the herald has been appropriated to a specific polis, its celebration of one victor, and its own history of victories. This ode demonstrates how productive the metaphor of song as message can be for the Epinician singer. The metaphor allows for the song to appear to come from a specific place, to integrate with local or familial connections via the components of the angelia, and to proclaim with the authority of the original a representation of the victory proclamation. In other instances, Pindar's use of the angelia is more elusive. In Olympian 4, for example, he begins the song with an invocation to Zeus, whom he calls on because the horai, personifications of the seasons, have sent him as a witness to the games. In other words, the time for games has arrived, and Pindar has witnessed great deeds. He immediately turns to the representation of his relationship with the victor Salmas as one of xenia, guest friendship. When guest friends do well, he sings, but xenon eu prasanton, line 4, when guest friends do well, is specific, since esloi, noble men, are cheered at the angulion glukeon, or sweet message. Therefore, couched in a gnomic expression is the angelia that results from a victory at Olympia, and Pindar represents himself as a witness at these games, who has heard the victory proclamation for Salmas and been gladdened by it. He returns to Zeus and offers up the Olympic victor and the victory Komos as offerings to a particularly localized Zeus who rules Mount Etna near Camarina, not Olympian Zeus of Olympia. The Komos is imagined as the carrier of the Angelia, lines 10 to 12. It comes in honor of the chariot of Salmas, who, crowned with peace and olive, is eager to arouse glory for Camarina. Pindar's representation of the Herald's Speech Act transforms it from an announcement to everyone at Olympia to a message of special significance for the social class of his patron. Here, Pindar's Angelia works to reimagine the diverse audience of Olympic athletes and spectators as a closed circle of social equals. His representation of the proclamation slyly adds a category, social status, those noble esloi, that was absent from the actual herald's proclamation. Perhaps the two most complex uses of the metaphor of song as message are in Olympian 8 and Olympian 14, where the angelia is personified in the former or closely identified with another personification in the latter. In Olympian 8, for the boy victor Alcimedon of Aegina, after a myth detailing the building of the walls of Troy, the song ends with a turn to the boy's trainer, Melesias, and the joy his victory has brought his grandfather, and in turn his greater family clan, the Blepsiadae. In a striking turn, Pindar imagines that the report of Alcimedon's victory, that is the song of choral Epinician, not the herald's proclamation, will reach even Hades. He embodies the personification of message, Hermes' daughter Angelia, to send the song to the underworld. These are lines 81 to 84. When Iphion hears the report from Hermes' daughter Angelia, he could tell Callimachus of the shining adornment at Olympia that Zeus granted to their family. The message that the goddess delivers is clear from the following clause, in which Iphion, once he hears it, may tell another relative of the victory at Olympia. The message emphasizes that Zeus gave this victory to their genos and correlates the personified angelia that can reach Hades with the Epinician song, since Pindar's song also emphasizes the additional victory for Alcimedon's family, the Blepsiadae. It's important to note here that the Blepsiadae would not have been mentioned at all in the herald's proclamation at Olympia. They're not part of the angelia. The personified angelia is a manifestation of the song as message metaphor, which emphasizes the broad possibility for the reception of Pindar's song at the same time as it underscores its authority as a representation of the herald's proclamation. In Olympian 14, a similar motif is used to spread the news of Ossippicus's Stadion victory beyond the mortal realm. These are lines 20 to 24. To the black-walled house of Persephone, go now, Echo, carrying the glorious news to his father, so that when you see Cleodamus, you can say that his son has crowned his youthful hair in the famous valley of Pisa with winged wreaths from the games that bring renown. Like Angelia in Olympian 8, Echo here has no real connection that we can discover with the victor, and there doesn't seem to have ever been a cult of Echo. Echo here, I think, is not sound or rumor generally, but echo in the actual literal sense of the word. The Kluton Angelion, glorious news, that she carries is supposedly the actual repeating sound of the herald's proclamation at Olympia, a true echo. The singer imagines Echo then telling Cleodamus in Hades of his son's victory at Olympia. As in Olympian 8, by equating his song with the angelia and representing the latter as able to penetrate the boundaries between living and dead, Pindar's Epinician song, in turn and implicitly, has the broadest possible reception. Unlike in choral epination, explicit references to the angelia or use of the poem as message metaphor are rare in epigram. In general, the absence may be explained by the spatial poetics of epigrams. They need not generally be imagined as messages that travel, since they are usually situated in the place of victory, for example, at Olympia or Delphi, or a place of memorial and celebration, many on the Acropolis at Athens, or the victor's home polis. Despite these constraints, the angelia informs the content of agonistic epigrams as much as it does choral epination. Even without explicit references to the angelia, some epigrams offer so short and apparently transparent a representation of the angelia that it is difficult to see them as anything other than a record. CEG 381, the inscription for Telon, found at Olympia, is a simple example. Telon, the son of Damon, a boxer, dedicated this, an Arcadian or Astasian and boy. And there's some part of the stone lost there. The components of the angelia are used to make up the subject of the dedicatory verb, so that the message itself is the agent of the dedication. What I mean is that the angelia's components, I guess, have been made collectively into the subject of the verb anatheka, right, dedicated. Even here, therefore, the poem as message metaphor transforms the angelia, an ephemeral speech act, into something more like a victor's crown, which can be dedicated in semi-permanent form to the gods in thanksgiving. In early epigrams, those from the archaic and classical periods, the record of the message is tacked onto the dedicatory narrative that forms the core of epigrams. That is, usually X dedicates Y. Participial phrases derived from the verb nikao attach an explanation of why something was dedicated, but in a way that almost quotes the herald. I'll remind you that the angelia, as pronounced by the herald after a victory, included a form of the verb nikao. Even simple representations may expand on the angelia formula slightly, though they still essentially imagine the inscription as the proclamation. Here's one, CEG 362. Aristus dedicated me to Lord Zeus, the son of Cronos, having won 4 times in the pancration at Nemea, the son of Phaedon of Cleonae. So you can see here the name of the victor, Aristus, who's also the dedicator of this inscription, his father's name, Phaedon, home polis, Cleonae, event, pancration. But the regular phrasing of dedicatory epigrams, X dedicates Y, is simply expanded with a participial phrase, nikon, having won, that evokes the herald's language. It also allows it to kind of spin it into a catalog of victories. This is not just 1 time at Nemea, but 4 times. By the 4th century BCE, epigrams often omit anatithemi or similar verbs, yet the metaphor of poem as message is still not exploited to a great degree. As early as the first 2 decades of the 4th century, and certainly by 368 BCE, agonistic epigrams appear without dedicatory phrasing. Epigrams still often include all of the aspects of the angelia, with some components separated out into prose titles. One exception is the relatively long CEG 862, the only extant epigram of which I'm aware to represent the angelia without explicitly or implicitly representing the herald. This long, somewhat long anyways, complex epigram was found at Olympia and erected by Xenombrotus, a victor in horse racing. I'll read it in full. For those who take notice, a true report says that the equestrian victory was the most beautiful at that Olympics, where the son of Xenodikos, first of the Coans, seizing the Pisan prize, led it to the island of Merops. Xenombrotus, you see, just as he was. His unquenchable fame, Hellas sings as a memorial of horsemanship. We're a long way from Telon's simple epigram. This epigram represents itself as a message, though one that is characterized as true, although the truth of this fatus or report is restricted to a subset of the audience, assuming the word is reconstructed properly at the beginning, pouthomenos, those who take notice. The epigram calls out for an audience, as many epigrams do, and presents itself as a bearer of truth to the audience, who turn their attention to and read aloud its contents. The contents of the angelia follow, though couched in an elusive narrative of excellence. the victor's name, Xenombrotus, his father's name, Xenodikos, his home city, or island in this case, Kos, the event, the horse race, and festival, the Olympics. The inclusion of a boast of special victory, koion protos, first of the koans, adds what scholars call surplus value to the victory and represents it as part of the proclamation, especially since this inscription is emphatic. This is a true report. There's no arguing with it. The Angelia here, however, is not simply the facts of victory, but rather the report of a most beautiful victory, and the contents of the proclamation are presented so as to end with the victor's name. Xenombrotus' name is prefaced with an appeal to the audience to view the statue and to see the victor toios hopoion, just as he was. This instance of the inscription as message metaphor uses its statuary accompaniment to restage the proclamation, this time with its own true report standing in for the herald's Angelia, and the victor statue a perfect recreation of the victorious Xenombrotus. The epigram ends by situating Xenombrotus' victory in a larger context, both spatially and culturally. Whereas epigrams are generally imagined as stationary and derive their potency as memorials of kleos from their longevity and their statues, Xenombrotus' epigram uses the poem as message metaphor to make this epigram, like the Angelia it purports to represent, the beginning of a tradition of oral and especially epic song. This song begins then from Olympia, just as the Angelia that announced Xenombrotus' victory. Not only does the text of the epigram report the movement of the prize to Kos, but in the final 1.5 verses, it claims that Greece itself will sing Xenombrotus' kleos, his unquenchable fame Hellas sings as a memorial of horsemanship. In this line, the epigram integrates itself into epic verse. Kleos aphtheton, unquenchable fame, is the same type of fame to which Achilles may lay claim in Iliad 9. The inscription is the beginning of a song that will be heard not only in Olympia when visitors stop to read it, but all over Greece. The Angelia is therefore represented as the beginning of a song of athletic and epic glory. This new mobile kleos, however, remains tied to the statue at Olympia. Not only is the true report the beginning of the song of Xenombrotus' kleos aphtheton, but also his physical appearance, given eternal form in the shape of the statue, where the epigram ends by telling us to imagine him toios hopoion, just as he was. The song as message metaphor is inflected by the formal and spatial constraints of epigram, which depend on both the transformation of the ephemeral reading of the epigram, that is, readers must take this imagined message with them when they leave Olympia, otherwise it's just stuck there, but it also relies on the specific landscape of Olympia and the anthropomorphic material form of its victor situated there. While the metaphor of song as message is prominent throughout the Epinician odes, the singer himself may also be approximated, like his song, to a figure of importance at the games, that is, the herald. The simplest way that the singer approximates the voice of the herald is to describe the proclamation in song. While these representations appear to narrate victory, it is crucial to recall that the herald's proclamation in Epinician song is an appropriation. The actual proclamation of the herald is as inaccessible to contemporary criticism as it was to most ancient audiences. The singer's guise as herald therefore acts, just as with the evocation of the Angelia above, to improve on the authenticity of his message. Rather than receive a commission, the herald is obliged to proclaim victory because it is his ritual role at Olympia. The herald proclaims, but does not praise a victor. Through the persona of the herald, the singer claims an authoritative voice with the ability to describe and delineate the victor, to alter an identity from competitor to victor, and to explain his insistence on praising his patron. Achilles, for example, narrates the proclamation in Ode 10 for an unknown victor in the foot race. I'll read this excerpt in full. For when he had come to a halt at the finishing line of the spring, panting out a hot storm of breath, and again when he had wet with his oil the cloaks of the spectators as he tumbled into the packed crowd after rounding the course with its 4 turns, the spokesman of the wise judges twice proclaimed him Isthmian victor, twice also in Nemea by the holy altar of Zeus, son of Cronos, and famous Thebes welcomed him, and spacious Argos and Sicyon, as was his due. Also the inhabitants of Pallene and the rich cornland of Euboea and the sacred island. The victory of the athlete is narrated vividly. As he wins the Hippias race, he turns so quickly that oil from his naked body wets the closely packed crowd of onlookers. It's the penalty of a front row seat, I guess. The herald proclaims him immediately, but as Bacchylides represents the proclamation, it is modulated at the point of victory into a victory catalog, which describes 2 Isthmian and 2 Nemean victories, as well as then some further victories in minor games. Needless to say, this is a fantasy, since the herald would not proclaim a victor immediately after the end of an event, nor would the herald enumerate a victor's athletic record. Bacchylides, however, inserts a victory catalog into a swiftly moving narrative of athletic action, victory, and proclamation. The poet as herald metaphor makes possible the conflation of victory, proclamation, and celebration. Proclamation once again becomes praise in the mouth of a would-be herald poet. Near the end of Olympian 13, Pindar uses the figure of the herald to evoke the 60 times that the herald at Isthmia and Nemea announced the victories of the Oligaethidai, the clan of his patron Xenophon. As, quote, as for their victories at the Isthmus and Nemea, in a brief word I shall reveal their sum, and my true witness under oath shall be the noble herald's sweet-tongued shout, heard full 60 times from both those places. Here, Pindar imagines himself an orator at court with the herald as his witness. The veracity of the herald's proclamation is brought to bear, since Pindar regards the haduglossos boa, sweet-tongued shout, as analogous to a witness exorkos, under oath. Moreover, the herald's voice is implicitly correlated with the Epinician song that it actually prompts. The adjective haduglossos evokes the regular description of song as sweet across the Epinician corpus. Furthermore, the herald himself is noble, an adjective that transforms him from a neutral figure at the Panhellenic Games into a member of the noble class. Here, therefore, the utility of the figure of the herald is transparent. His is a trustworthy and socially compatible voice that forms the basis of Epinician song, and the sweetness of his voice can be seen as proleptically characterizing the Epinician song that he prompts. Trustworthiness may be particularly at stake in this ode. The 60 crowns of the Oligaethidai are the highest number reported by Pindar. In contrast to his inability to record vast numbers at other times, those of the Oligaethidai can actually be enumerated. Pindar supports the number of successes at the Isthmian and Nemean games by reference to the unassailable accuracy of the herald's voice. The vast sum of crowns is contrasted with the simple form in which Pindar claims it will appear, paurai epe, in a brief word. Nonetheless, these appeals to truth are rhetorical, since the herald would not have announced the genos as part of the Engalea at the Panhellenic Games. And indeed, it is far more likely that these great athletic families, like the Oligaethidai or Blepsiadae, kept their own private register of Panhellenic victories. The account of victories of the Oligaethidai forms part of the instructions that must have accompanied the commissioning of the poem, not the content of an actual ritual proclamation at Olympia. Given the interaction of statue and epigram, as well as individual readers and collective audiences, epigrams do not offer a clear-cut poet as herald metaphor. Still, some voices can be determined. In these epigrams, I suggest we can see the motif of epigram as herald deployed when the voice assumed by the text is that of the herald. In some cases, especially in those that apostrophize the victor, the connection between herald and epigram is implicit. In others, especially those with verbs of proclaiming or crowning, the composer of the epigram makes an explicit connection between reader and herald. Instances where the epigram addresses the victor occur across 5th and 4th century epigrams. Taking these as scripts that ultimately derive from a particular performance context, I understand the voice of the epigram as representing or implying that of the herald. When the epigrammatic voice addresses the victor in the second person, the speaker of the poem is herald and the statue a surrogate for the victor. CEG 346, for example, a somewhat long poem from the 2nd quarter of the 5th century attached to a marble base at Delphi addresses the victor. And as you can see, this poem has a lot of damage to the right side of the stone. So we're missing things, but I think we can still get the idea. Victorious twice at Pytho, etc. 7 times at Nemea, 5 times you crown, Pythodelos, for power follows, Pythagoras, the son of Pythodelos. So it's quite fragmentary. But if the marble base held a victor's statue, then the reader of this epigram explicitly recreates the proclamation, since he addresses Pythodelos through his bronze surrogate. The proclamation of this reader come herald, however, differs from that of the actual herald at Delphi. While the right side of the stone is largely missing, it's clear that a victory catalog began the complete epigram and ran onto the second line as well. These are these 2 times at Pytho, 6 times at Nemea, 5 times, etc. Thus, with the second person verb stephanois, you crown, the reperformance of the engalea here puts a victory catalog into the mouth of the reader as herald. Finally, the only partially extant part of the right side of the stone is the 4th line, which seems to offer a comment on victory. While fragmentary, it may say something like praise of strength follows, or something like that, kratos despeta, and then an ep. The reader, apparently speaking with the herald's voice, not only adds a victory catalog, but once again, the herald's proclamation has been repurposed as praise. Here, as in CEG 862 for Xenombrotus, with a permanent representation of the victor standing by, ready to always and eternally receive his crown. Other second-person addresses seem to operate similarly, with the voice of the herald the only persona available to the reader of an epigram. CEG 788 is a mostly complete and straightforward example. This fragment of a limestone base was found at Thespiae and dates to around 350 BCE. It includes all the elements of the actual engalea in an apostrophe to the victor. I'll read it in full. Aeschylus, Olympic victor, you were crowned in the wrestling for boys, son of Glaucus, you glorified your homeland, Thespiae. Even here in a relatively straightforward example, the herald's voice is modulated to include the festival in a compound adjective modifying the victor's name, Olympionika, Olympic victor, and the final clause includes his homeland, but as an object of the verb eukleo, you glorified, not simply proclaimed. Therefore, the epigram makes explicit the praise of the homeland that athletic victory and the herald's proclamation only implied. An important point, perhaps, for an inscription situated at home, this stone was found in Thespiae, and for an audience who were mostly not at the Olympic victory. Moreover, this explicitness may be crucial since in its representation in epigram, the engalea lost the ritual and religious context that ensured it was a potent act. Here, therefore, we can see how the location of an epigram and dedication can use the persona of the herald not only to recreate the proclamation as a way of glorifying the victor, but also in his home polis as a way of demonstrating the glory that he brought to the city itself. By configuring the persona of the herald as that, by configuring the persona of the reader as that of the herald, the authenticity of the herald's voice is transferred to the reader. For example, CEG 811, a dedication found at Delphi and dated to 365 BCE, addresses Sostratus the Sicyonian. I'll read the whole thing. I'll read the whole thing. With many of the most beautiful crowns indeed, Sostratus, son of Sosistratus, you glorified your homeland of Sicyon, winning thrice in the Pancration at Olympia, twice at Pytho, and 12 crowns from the Isthmus and Nemea. It is impossible to indicate the other crowns by number, and having stopped your competitors, you used to win frequently without battle. So this is an epigram for an astonishingly successful athlete. While prose title provides the victor's name and polis, all elements of the engalea are still provided in the long epigram. The reader of this epigram assumes the herald's voice with his address of the victor in line 1 and characterizes the victories as a glory for his homeland of Sicyon. The first word of the poem, pleistois, anticipates the catalog of victories and the word pleista near the end. A 3-line catalog of victories follows, capped on the 3rd line with an apology for the inability to count the number of crowns outside the Panhellenic contests, an aporia familiar from Epinician song. Finally, the last line adds a boast of special victory by recalling how many times, pleista, Sostratus won aconiti, that is, when he was crowned because competitors dared not face him in the Pancration, a not completely uncommon occurrence, right? If you saw some hulking guy, you might decide, I'm not going to go into the ring with him. The final lines, placed, bring the reader back to the initial placestois and connects the many crowns he won with the many times he won without contest. It's a neatly composed epigram. The frequentative aspect is emphasized not only by the recollection of the beginning, but by the use of ekrates in the imperfect tense. Each time this epigram is enunciated by the reader as herald, the aspect of the verb implies the continuing reality of Sostratus's record. It'd be nice to know what this statue looked like. One of the longest agonistic epigrams to survive from my period, for arguably the most famous athlete in antiquity, Theogenes of Thasos, also preserves an address to the victor and a narration of the herald's proclamation. CEG 844 is a limestone base for a now lost bronze statue and dates to the first half of the 4th century and was found at Delphi. The epigram is a mostly complete 12 lines with a 4-column prose addendum containing Theogenes' victory record at the Panhellenic contests. And I'll read it in full. There's just a small bit missing at the beginning. Of Thasos, son of Timoxenes, and you have much praise for strength among the Greeks, for no one was crowned at Olympia the same man, winning in boxing and pancration. And at Pytho there were 3 crowns for you without competition, but no other mortal man did this. And a 9th and 10th victories at the Isthmian Games, for twice did shout out the herald, you alone in the circle of men, a victory song of boxing and pancration on the same day. And 9 times in Nemea Theogenes, and the private victories 1,300. And I say that you were not defeated in boxing for 22 years. So as I said, I mean, Theogenes' record, if true, is probably unassailed in the history of sport, I guess. The epigram addresses Theogenes and incorporates many of the aspects of the Engalia. Of course, for an athlete with as long and successful as a career as that of Theogenes, the expansion to the catalog is an obvious claim to further glory. What is more unusual is the epigram includes a tally of his complete number of victories, 1,300. Contrast it with Sostratus's that I just read, which said the number you've done is unable to be counted. Here we can actually enumerate the victories. The prose catalog below, which I haven't included on the slide, includes victories in the Panhellenic circuit. Theogenes' success, however, goes beyond being a periodonticase, that is a winner of all the 4 main Panhellenic games, since he won in boxing and pancration at Olympia, and counted 3 wins at the Pythian Games akoniti, that is without competition. He also, rather incredibly, given the brutality of these sports, won boxing and pancration at Isthmia on the same day. Theogenes' epigram ends with a claim to surplus value as if he needed it. He was not defeated across over 2 decades of competition, and for a combat athlete, that's unparalleled. All of these claims to surplus value are given in a speech act, unfortunately fragmentary at the opening, for which the epigram is a script. Readers thus take on a persona when they read this epigram, a persona that I suggest at least evokes the herald, given the representation of the Engalia that is embedded here. Theogenes' epigram, however, expands from the motif of encouraging the reader to imagine himself as a herald to the reader becoming a narrator of other proclamations. At line 7-8, which I've underlined in bold, the reader of this epigram narrates the act of the herald at Isthmia, an important moment when Theogenes obtained his unparalleled victory, or another unparalleled victory, that of winning boxing and pancration on the same day. The epigram therefore evokes the authority of the herald's voice in the same way as some Epinician odes, and incorporates a claim to surplus value into the report. However, the epigram moves beyond mere representation of the proclamation and maps the movement from proclamation to oral song in the same way as Pindar does, since the herald's proclamation is imagined as a poetic form itself on line 9, an epinikion. So here we have imagined as the reader reads it, that the proclamation becomes a victory song, even from this stone at Delphi. Theogenes' epigram, which connects explicitly through word choice, epigram and epinician, is a good place for me to stop today. His poem makes clear that at least in the 5th century BCE, victors had 2 choices when it came to celebrating their victories, or at least 2 choices: Epinician songs and inscribed poems attached to statue bases. Both, despite the latter reception of Epinician as high art and epigrams as repetitive documents, use the metaphors of message and herald to great effect. Both permit the singer to explain his eagerness to praise at the same time as they grant authority to the praise itself. Authenticity in both genres is key, since Epinician song and epigrams frequently expand on the information of the Engalia, attach more victories, include more people, and so on. By representing their praise as mere proclamation, Epinician songs and epigrams represent their own performances, whenever and however they are performed, as a significant speech act of the herald, the actualization of victory itself, rather than the commissioned and carefully constructed work of poet and patron. Thank you very much.